The fog had a way of swallowing sound along the channel, softening footfalls, muting voices, and turning even the creak of ropes into whispers. It was under such a veil of mist that Hercule Poirot arrived at the lonely ferry dock in Fenmore, his small leather case clutched in gloved hands, eyes narrowed not from the cold, but from the question already forming behind them. The telegram had been terse, unsigned save the initials BL, and hauntingly vague. "He is alive, Poirot, or something is pretending to be." Intrigued and unsettled, the great detective had come, not for murder, but for a resurrection. The ferry itself, the Crooked Bell, was an aging vessel of chipped paint and yawning shadows, moored as if reluctant to leave shore again. Waiting for him at the far end of the dock was Beatrice Landry, her figure wrapped in a dark wool coat, her gloved hands trembling not from the chill, but from whatever storm raged beneath her composed surface. When she stepped forward to greet Poirot, it was not with the warmth of reunion, but the desperate urgency of someone who had glimpsed a ghost and was now forced to name it. "You received my message?" she asked quietly. Poirot inclined his head, "And came at once. But you must tell me, mademoiselle, who is it you believe to be alive?" She hesitated, glancing toward the water where the dark silhouette of the ferry shifted slightly in the tide. "My brother Edmund," she whispered, "dead these past 6 years. Drowned. We buried an empty casket. But yesterday, aboard that ferry." "Yes, I saw him, Monsieur Poirot, standing near the engine-room door, drenched in fog, smiling at me like the night he vanished." Poirot did not blink. "And what did he say?" "Nothing," she said. "He only stared as if waiting." He paused, considering her words carefully. "And yet you doubt your eyes." "I doubt everything," she whispered, her voice splintering. "Because he is dead. Because I signed the certificate myself. And because if that was Edmund, then someone has committed a far greater crime than murder." From the gloom, the bell of the ferry let out a low, dragging peal, once, then twice. The sound rolled across the water like an omen. Beside it, the lighthouse loomed like a sleeping sentinel, its windows dark, its key said to rest only in the vicar's possession. And somewhere in the swirling gray, a presence watched. Poirot turned slowly toward the vessel, then back to Beatrice. "You say you saw your brother, but did anyone else?" "No," she said, "just me. But someone locked the chapel door from the inside, and the captain swears he heard 2 voices in the hold, though only one man was ever seen entering." Poirot tapped a finger against his lips. "Then let us board this Crooked Bell, mademoiselle. Let us take her last voyage once more, because if the dead do walk again, they seldom do so without purpose." As the two of them stepped onto the ferry's deck, the fog seemed to thicken, curling around their feet like the memory of something never properly buried. Below the waves, the sea gave nothing back, not even the echo of the bell that tolled again from the tower that no one claimed to have entered. And somewhere, in the silence that followed, something watched and waited. The Crooked Bell groaned softly as its engine stirred to life, a sound like breath caught in a dying throat. Beneath the leaden sky, the channel stretched in dull silver waves, the morning fog refusing to lift. Hercule Poirot stepped lightly onto the deck, his gaze sweeping across the small, curated world of passengers who had already boarded. It was a modest roster, 8 in total, but already Poirot noted the quiet unease that threaded between them, like a piano string stretched too tight. Beatrice walked beside him, her pace slower now, her eyes wary. "They don't know why you're here," she murmured. "No," Poirot said softly, "and it is better that way for now." Inside the saloon, the passengers sat like chess pieces placed mid-game. They looked up as Poirot entered, some with polite curiosity, others with guarded suspicion. The atmosphere was wrong for such a mundane crossing. Too many unreadable glances, too many silences that came half a second too late. Captain Alton Dalglash, a stout, weather-beaten man with eyes like tired glass, approached with a nod. "Didn't expect we'd have the great Monsieur Poirot on board," he said with a strained smile. "Hope this isn't a holiday." Poirot returned the smile, though his eyes remained fixed on the faces beyond. "Hardly, Captain. I seldom travel for pleasure." He gestured gently. "Perhaps you would introduce me to your voyagers?" Dalglash glanced around, then cleared his throat. "Well, let's see. That's Colonel Jasper Whitmore, retired Army, Gibraltar, I believe. Keeps to himself mostly. Beside him is Miss Arabella Petton, governess to the Thornfield family once. Lost her post in some scandal, if rumors are true." Colonel Whitmore gave a curt nod, his expression carved from granite. Miss Petton, stiff and composed in her worn navy coat, merely blinked. "Over there by the window, that's Geoffrey Thornfield, heir to the Thornfield estate and shipping business, now that his father's passed. Drinks more than he should." Geoffrey Thornfield raised his glass faintly in acknowledgement, slouching deeper into the corner, like a man already trying to forget something important. "And that's Mademoiselle Claire Dubois," Dalglash added, nodding toward the striking Frenchwoman who sat alone, gloved hands folded over a worn leather book. "Says she's here researching something. She's taken the crossing twice this month." Poirot bowed slightly toward her, and she offered a tight, courteous smile, though her eyes didn't quite reach his. "And then there's Dr. Arnold Kersey," the captain concluded, nodding toward a tall, gaunt man near the stairwell, "and his assistant, James Langley, I believe. Archaeologists. They're returning from an excavation in Belgium." Dr. Kersey barely looked up from his notes, while Langley gave Poirot a nod that wavered between respect and indifference. Poirot turned back toward Beatrice. "A curious cast," he whispered, "each alone in their own way, each with something they do not say." Beatrice's gaze wandered toward the narrow stairwell that led to the lower decks, and yet none of them saw Edward. Not a single soul. Poirot's eyes lingered on the bolted chapel door toward the rear of the ferry, a door the captain insisted had not been opened in over a year. And yet, during the last crossing, someone had heard the bell toll. Twice. He approached it slowly, his footsteps echoing against the wood. The brass handle was cold to the touch, and the scent that escaped the hinges was unmistakable. Mildew and something fainter, like old incense and candle wax. He glanced back over his shoulder. The others had returned to their conversations, though the tension in the room hummed just beneath the surface. "It begins here, Hastings," Poirot whispered to me, his voice calm. "This ship, this crossing, it is not merely a journey across water. It is a return." "To what?" I asked. "To guilt," he replied. "To fear, and perhaps to a truth someone buried at sea, but which refuses to stay drowned." And behind us, through the glass of the saloon window, the first gull of the day passed overhead, silent, watching, and gone. The first stirrings of the storm came not with thunder, but with stillness. The sea lost its rhythm. The gulls vanished. The crooked bell pressed on through a vast, unnatural quiet, as though the world were inhaling and forgetting how to breathe. Poirot stood near the outer railing, his gloved hands folded over the rail, as if feeling for a pulse beneath the steel. The horizon had vanished into a thick, colorless fog. Captain Dalglash barked an order to reduce speed, his voice clipped with the knowledge that the channel could turn vengeful without warning. Below deck, the atmosphere tightened. Geoffrey Thornfield paced like a man cornered by ghosts, sipping nervously from his silver hip flask. Colonel Whitmore remained in his chair, his rigid posture betraying the military instinct to remain composed when all else threatened collapse. Miss Petton stared into her teacup, lips trembling ever so slightly, and Mademoiselle Dubois, graceful, unreadable, had taken to sketching in the margins of her book, though the pencil in her hand had not moved in several minutes. Poirot entered the lounge with measured steps. "There is something unnatural about this silence, MES Amos. It is not the sea I mistrust, but what hides behind the lull." He looked around the room. "And now I must ask, has anyone entered the chapel since we departed Calais?" A murmur of surprise rippled through the group. Captain Dalglash looked confused. "The chapel's sealed, Monsieur Poirot. No one's touched it since we boarded." Poirot tilted his head slightly, and yet he walked slowly toward the thick oak door at the rear of the lounge. The chapel, small and forgotten, built into the ship's frame during another era, more ornamental than functional. As he reached for the handle, the lights flickered. A moan of wind tore across the outer deck, shaking the glass panes. Then, from beyond the door, a sound echoed so clearly it seemed impossible clang. A pause. Clang. The bell point two strikes point two, when no hand should have been near the rope. Gasps rose behind us. Beatrice stumbled back, her face draining of color. "You heard it," she whispered. "You all heard it this time." Poirot said nothing. His fingers, steady as ever, twisted the old iron handle. The door creaked open. The room beyond was dark, lit only by the swinging of a single lantern overhead, its flame flickering violently though the air was still. At the center stood the bell. Large, unyielding, silent now. And beneath it, in the half-light, lay something that should not have been there. A coat, folded neatly on the floor. Beside it, a pair of gloves and an envelope. Poirot crouched, retrieving the letter and reading it aloud. "To whom it may concern, if you are reading this, then the sea has failed me. My name is Edward. I did not fall from the ferry. I was pushed." A stunned silence took hold. Geoffrey Thornfield's flask clattered to the floor. Colonel Whitmore leaned forward, fists clenched. Miss Petton's hand flew to her mouth. Mademoiselle Dubois whispered, "But they said he drowned." Poirot rose, his face calm, but his eyes sharp with fire. "This is no longer a question of accident or suicide. It is murder. And the murderer," he glanced over his shoulder at the shivering roomful of strangers, "is aboard this ferry." Suddenly, the lights cut out completely. The engine slowed. And outside, the storm began. The ferry groaned as the sea began to take hold. Lightning flared behind the fog, illuminating the lounge in brief, flickering intervals that made faces seem older, hollower. Somewhere below, the engine sputtered, coughed, and then fell silent. The crooked bell now drifted, a ghost ship caught in the mouth of the channel, surrounded by silence that howled louder than any wind. Poirot stood near the chapel doorway, the unsigned letter still in hand, his expression unreadable. Inspector Bradley, summoned earlier in Dover and now forced to remain aboard due to the worsening weather, stepped into the dim light. "The ship's wireless is down," he reported. "The crew's attempting repairs, but we're blind out here. The storm's cutting us off completely." Miss Petton was the first to speak, her voice brittle. "Then we are stranded? Alone?" Poirot corrected her gently. "Not alone, mademoiselle. We are in the company of the dead, and one who would see another join him." Bradley approached the letter, brow furrowed. "This Edward, do we know who he is?" Captain Dalglash answered from the threshold. "There's no passenger by that name on the manifest. No crew either." Poirot gestured toward the chapel. "And yet here is his confession." Geoffrey Thornfield, pale and swaying slightly from drink, spoke up. "It's madness. You're chasing shadows. My father's dead, yes, but you can't expect us to believe a ghost left this note." Poirot turned slowly. "I believe, monsieur, in facts. And here they are. This letter was not weathered. The ink is fresh. The handwriting precise. This man, Edward, was here, is still here, or his killer is." The storm outside raged louder now. The ship rocked with growing aggression. Chairs slid. A glass fell from a sideboard and shattered. A steward passed hurriedly behind them, whispering something to another. Fear, once hidden in the corners of the room, now stood openly among them. Poirot motioned to the captain. "We must keep the passengers contained. No one is to return to their cabins alone." "Agreed," the captain said, signaling his crew. Poirot paced to the center of the room, where the fire in the hearth had begun to sputter. "I will ask questions now. You will answer plainly. This ship is no longer bound merely by tide and propeller. It is bound by truth." His gaze fell first upon Mademoiselle Dubois. "You claim to be a language tutor, yes? But your accent, it slips. Parisian, occasionally. Other times, Brussels. What is your true origin?" She hesitated, then lifted her chin. "My mother was Belgian. My father, French. I was raised between borders." Poirot's brow arched. "As was I. Yet you use idioms unfamiliar even to me." She said nothing. Next, his eyes moved to Colonel Whitmore. "And you, Colonel, served in India?" "Yes," he replied stiffly. "As I said when we boarded." Poirot nodded. "And the Thornfields?" "I knew Reginald through business. Mining." Poirot's eyes narrowed. Strange. I found no record of you on any board or registry. The colonel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Poirot turned at last to Geoffrey Thornfield. Tell me again, where were you the hour your father died? Geoffrey's eyes flashed. I was in the lounge. With all of you. Poirot stepped closer. Ah, but not continuously. There was a span of, 12 minutes? When you disappeared. You said you were ill. And yet the steward did not see you near the lavatory. I stepped out for air, Geoffrey said. That's not a crime. No, Poirot agreed softly. But murder is. The room recoiled at the word. Outside, thunder cracked, closer now. Poirot returned to the fire. We're being watched, M.E.S. Amos. Not by ghosts, but by truth. Edward is not a ghost. He was someone on this ferry. And he died in silence because no one asked who he truly was. Inspector Bradley leaned in. So what's our next move? Poirot stared into the flames. We find Edward. His name may not be on the manifest, but somewhere aboard this ferry. He waits. Perhaps in a cabin unclaimed. Perhaps in a body unburied. He turned back to us. No one leaves this room alone. Not until the past comes knocking. The storm howled louder still, and somewhere, beyond the reach of the living, the bell in the chapel rang again. Once, and then again. The storm had settled into a rhythm now, a dreadful, constant percussion of waves and thunder that felt less like nature's fury, and more like time itself knocking at the hull. The crooked bell groaned under the weight of its secrets. Below deck, the air had changed. Damp, metallic, and unnervingly still, as if the ship, like its passengers, had stopped breathing. Poirot descended the narrow staircase with calculated care, Inspector Bradley just behind him. I followed, a reluctant third, gripping the polished rail as the ship rolled uneasily. The corridor that stretched before us was lined with polished mahogany doors, each identical in its denial. Yet Poirot paused before one, cabin 12. It was Captain Dalglash who said this cabin was never assigned, Poirot said, running his gloved fingers along the brass plate. And yet, here we are. Do you feel it, Hastings? The air. It is different here. Bradley stepped forward and knocked, sharply. No answer. He nodded, inserted the master key, and pushed the door open. The smell hit us first. Stale cologne. Old paper. Something faintly, sweet and wrong. The cabin was immaculately ordered, too ordered. A traveling case sat on the bed, unopened. A pressed coat hung neatly on the hook by the door. And on the desk, a leather-bound journal, a silver fountain pen, and a photograph of a woman in a white dress, her face obscured by a deep scratch across the glass. Poirot moved like a man walking through memory. Someone has stayed here, he murmured, but someone who did not want to be seen. Bradley opened the wardrobe. Inside, 3 neatly folded shirts, 1 pair of shoes, and a set of cufflinks, initialed E.M. His brow furrowed. No ticket, no name. But this isn't a stowaway. This man paid to be here. The question is, where is he now? Poirot examined the journal. The entries were sparse, fragmented, and strange. She still looks at me like I'm 17 and stained with smoke. Thornfield knows. He recognized me. But he said nothing. I rang the bell at midnight. I wanted her to hear. I wanted her to remember. If this ship goes down, let the truth float. Poirot looked up sharply. This is no madman's rambling. This is a confession. From the hallway, a steward appeared, his face pale. Sirs, there's something you should see. In the hold. We weren't meant to open it until Dover. But with the storm, we followed him through the warren of crew access corridors, deeper into the belly of the ship. The air grew colder, the metal walls sweating with condensation. Finally, he led us into the cargo hold. In the far corner, among crates of luggage and tarpaulin-covered trunks, was a single coffin. It was unmarked. No tags. No documentation. The steward looked at Bradley. This wasn't on any manifest. Poirot approached slowly, reverently. Open it. The lid groaned as it was lifted. Inside, a man pale and preserved, his hands folded over his chest. A faint scar beneath the chin. His eyes mercifully closed. Beside him, tucked into the lining, a set of papers. Poirot took them gently. The name on the certificate, Edward Matthew Thornfield. Bradley exhaled slowly. That's Reginald's brother, presumed dead in France 20 years ago. Poirot's voice was low, but not dead. Hidden, buried in life by the Thornfield name, and now returned in death, or perhaps brought back. Then who wrote the journal? I asked. Who stayed in cabin 12? Poirot turned the last page. A final entry. They never knew. About the girl. About the fire. But he did. He always did. I warned him. I said it would end like this. Poirot looked up. It was not Edward who stayed in this cabin. It was someone who knew Edward. Someone who came to make sure his death would not remain silent. Bradley whispered. Someone who came to finish what the grave couldn't. Poirot closed the journal. We are not dealing with a single death, Inspector. We are dealing with a chain of them, each linked by guilt, silence, and the weight of a name. From above, the storm gave a great crack, and somewhere down the corridor, a bell rang once, then again, and then a third time. No hands on a rope, only history. The ship groaned as though it were turning in its sleep, and the storm raged harder now, waves slapping the hull, like the hands of the dead demanding entry. In the dining lounge, the passengers had gathered again, their faces pale and uncertain, their glances sharp and flickering with fresh suspicion. Something unspoken had passed through the ship, like a current of ice. Word of the unregistered coffin had spread, despite the steward's insistence on silence. No one ate. No one spoke above a whisper. Poirot, immaculate as always despite the worsening storm, entered the room with the slow certainty of a man preparing to rearrange the very fabric of belief. Beside him, Inspector Bradley kept his jaw tight, his eyes scanning every nervous tick and tightening throat. Mademoiselle Dubois sat with her hands folded tight in her lap, a pale blur of knuckles against navy silk. Miss Peton had taken to the far corner, as if the flickering lamp above her could conceal whatever stillness now clung to her. Colonel Whitmore stood by the bar unmoved, staring into a drink he hadn't touched for over an hour. And Geoffrey Thornfield, his father's face remade in younger skin, paced restlessly along the far wall, unable or unwilling to sit. Poirot's gaze was soft but unyielding. Forgive the intrusion, M.E.S. Amos, but we have discovered someone, that changes the entire complexion of our little crossing. A silence bloomed, taut and unnatural. Edward Thornfield, Poirot said simply. Geoffrey stopped pacing. That's impossible. Uncle Edward died in France. Poirot nodded. So they told you. But Edward did not die in France. He was erased, hidden, forgotten. Until now, his body is in the hold of this very ship. And yet, I believe he returned once more, not just in death, but in shadow. The silence broke like glass. Mademoiselle Dubois let out a gasp. Miss Peton rose halfway from her chair, eyes wide with recognition. Or was it terror? Poirot stepped closer. There is someone here who knew Edward. Knew him not as a myth, but as a man, who recognized his return, or feared it. And I believe that person is sitting in this very room. Inspector Bradley stepped forward. Let's not dance around it. We'll question every one of you again, this time under oath if necessary. No need, came a voice. Low, flat, heavy. Everyone turned. It was Miss Peton. I knew Edward, she said. Before the war. Before any of this. When I was young. He was kind. He wanted to marry me, you see. But his family wouldn't allow it. I was a servant's daughter. A nobody. Geoffrey looked stunned. That's a lie. No, Miss Peton said more softly. It's not. We were to run away. But then the fire happened. The girl. She stopped. Poirot moved like a shadow beside her. Yes, the girl. The one whose name none of you speak aloud. The girl who died in that mysterious fire. And Edward. He was blamed, was he not? Silently. Brutally. They could not afford scandal. Miss Peton nodded slowly. They told me to forget him. To lie. And I did. For years. Until I heard the bell. Poirot turned back to the room. That bell, M.E.S. Amos. It rang not because of ghosts, but because someone could no longer bear the weight of silence. Miss Petton booked cabin 12 in Edward's name, hoping to draw Thornfield into remembering, interfering, and when he didn't, when he scoffed. Bradley stepped forward. "You're saying she killed Reginald?" But Poirot raised a hand. "No. Miss Petton came here to frighten, to remind, but not to kill." Miss Petton, eyes glistening, whispered, "I couldn't have. I don't have it in me. I wanted him to feel the weight of what he buried. I wanted him to see the coffin." Poirot looked across the room, but someone else did have it in them. Someone who saw Edward return in that coffin and realized that their own past might be next to resurface. Someone who had more than shame to lose. Someone with blood on their hands, long before the ferry set sail. He turned toward the colonel, then paused. "No, not him." Poirot's gaze landed on someone else entirely, and in that moment I saw it too. The shift, the cracking of the mask. Poirot said one final thing, barely above a whisper. It was never just about Edward. It was about what he saw before he was buried. The truth was no longer knocking at the door. It had entered. The waves that lapped against the ferry's hull had calmed slightly by evening, but the tension inside the Royal Victoria Hotel, where we were now confined by Inspector Bradley's orders, had only grown heavier. The passengers had been scattered into their respective quarters, yet no one truly rested. There's a kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from the breath held before a scream, and that silence pressed into every corner of the dining room as Poirot called us together once more, beneath the gaslights that flickered as if unsure whether to reveal or to conceal. Each suspect had taken their seat with visible reluctance. Colonel Whitmore sat rigid, his hands folded so tightly his knuckles blanched. Miss Petton, her confession of past heartbreak still lingering in the room like forgotten perfume, sat folded into herself, as though she had already been buried with Edward Thornfield's lost future. Mademoiselle Dubois clutched her shawl, as if to protect herself from a cold that had nothing to do with the wind outside. And Geoffrey Thornfield, his father's features etched now with the darkened weight of legacy, sat unblinking, staring at the empty space on the wall where a clock had once hung. Poirot did not sit. He remained standing, fingers laced neatly at his waist, as if the truth were already lined up like chess pieces on a board only he could see. "You all believe," he began slowly, "that the heart of this mystery is the coffin and the cargo hold. And indeed, the body of Edward Thornfield was meant to return to English soil with dignity and quiet. But it is not the coffin that carries the weight of this story. It is what the coffin uncovered." No one spoke. The rain had begun again, light this time, like whispers against glass. Poirot continued, his voice steady and controlled, each word a precise cut. "The killer is here among us. This much you know. But you have been asking the wrong question. Not who hated Reginald Thornfield, but who feared him." He walked slowly toward the center of the room. Reginald Thornfield did not die merely because of his past in India. That history made him cruel, yes, but cruelty is not always sufficient to provoke murder. No, he was killed because of what he knew, or rather, what he remembered. He turned suddenly to face Mademoiselle Dubois. "You were not merely a traveling companion, were you?" Her eyes widened. I told you I only met Mr. Thornfield twice." Non, mademoiselle. You told me what you rehearsed. But the truth is different. The truth is this. You were not on the ferry by accident. You were placed there by someone who believed you could be eliminated." Inspector Bradley's brow furrowed. "Eliminated?" Poirot nodded, because she, too, remembered Edward from before the war, when he stumbled across something, a shipment, a name, a face, something that did not belong in the Thornfield records, something tied not to India, but to France, to Marseilles, to a certain offshore account that Reginald Thornfield controlled, and when Edward refused to remain silent, he was removed. Bradley leaned forward. "And you're saying Dubois knew this? That she was next?" "No," Poirot said. "I'm saying she was the witness, as a child, and Edward kept her safe by helping her escape the orphanage. She owed him her life, which is why she came aboard, to accompany his body, quietly, respectfully." Dubois began to cry silently now, her shoulders trembling. Poirot turned toward the last figure, still silent. "Geoffrey." The young man flinched. "You knew," Poirot said softly. "You knew about the accounts. You knew that Edward had threatened to expose your father. You knew that if the will was reopened, if any of those secrets surfaced, you would lose everything." Geoffrey's eyes darted between Poirot and the inspector. "You're insane. I didn't even know Edward was on board." "Didn't you?" Poirot's voice sharpened. "You signed off on the shipping manifest. You were handling your father's estate. You knew where the body was. And you knew about the schedule. The 15-minute routine. Just enough time to slip into the maintenance corridor and out again. Just enough time to become invisible." Geoffrey stood up violently, his chair scraping across the floor. "He destroyed everything. My father may have been many things, but he was mine. And that ghost came back to ruin us all." Inspector Bradley stood now too, reaching for his cuffs. But Poirot raised a hand. "No need. He won't run. He knows it's finished." Geoffrey slumped back into the chair, defeated, his voice suddenly smaller. "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to listen, to go away." But he laughed, just like he used to, like I didn't matter at all. Poirot walked to the window, where the fog had started to lift at last. "Violence, monsieur, is never the final word, only the loudest, until truth arrives." And in that moment, I realized Poirot's greatest gift was not merely to untangle crimes, but to show us the thread of humanity behind each knot, however frayed, however bloodied. Morning arrived not with light, but with a sullen grayness that clung to the Dover harbor like a pall. The sea had quieted at last, but the storm had not truly passed. Inside the Royal Victoria Hotel, the air remained heavy, not with rain or wind, but with the awful stillness that follows revelation. The truth, like a long-withheld breath, had been exhaled, and now, in the echo, came the reckoning. Geoffrey Thornfield sat slumped in the corner of the drawing-room, his cuffed hands resting in his lap. He looked younger than he had the night before, no longer his father's mirror, but a boy broken by the weight of legacy. Inspector Bradley stood near the window, his notebook closed, his expression unreadable. The formalities had been completed, the confession taken, the arrangements made, but there was no satisfaction in it, only an uneasy quiet, as if even justice knew its hands were not entirely clean. Poirot stood alone by the hearth, his gaze fixed on the smoldering remains of the morning fire. There was no triumph in his posture, only a melancholy stillness, as though he were listening to the dying voice of something far older than crime. I stepped toward him quietly. "You were right," I said. "It was never about the murder. It was about memory, about rot buried too long." Poirot nodded, but did not speak. Lady Constance entered the room with the silent dignity of a woman long accustomed to grief. She said nothing to Geoffrey as she passed him, not in cruelty, but in understanding, perhaps the worst kind of understanding, the one that leaves no room for words. "I failed both of them," she said at last, addressing Poirot without looking at him. "The father and the son. I stood by and said nothing. When Reginald sent Edward away, when the rumors started, when the coffins began to close around us." Poirot finally turned from the fire. "Madam, silence is not always complicity. Sometimes it is survival. But silence, when held too long, becomes its own kind of cruelty." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She turned instead to her grandson. "You are not your father," she said quietly, "but you chose to carry his sins. That was your decision." Geoffrey's voice broke through the stillness, like something forgotten. "I didn't know who I was without him. I thought if I defended his name, maybe I'd matter." Poirot stepped forward, his voice gentle but clear. "And now, monsieur, you must learn who you are without lies. It is not a punishment. It is a chance." The constable arrived shortly after. Geoffrey stood without resistance. As he passed Poirot, he paused. "He never said he was proud of me. Not once." Poirot's eyes softened. "Then let this be the beginning of something different. Let your truth be the first thing said that is not a shadow." Geoffrey nodded once, and then he was gone. Outside, the fog had lifted almost completely, revealing the harbor in the flat light of early afternoon. The ferry sat at dock, its hull bruised but unbroken. A few seagulls circled overhead. The sea no longer roared. Poirot and I walked slowly along the promenade, the air crisp with salt and smoke. There are no clean endings in stories like this, are there? I asked. No, he said. Only clean beginnings, if we are brave enough to take them. As we boarded the carriage that would take us back to London, I looked once more toward the dock, where the waves now lapped gently at the stone. The channel had revealed its secrets, but at a cost. Lives had been broken, names stained, but truth, at last, had rung louder than silence. And behind us, somewhere in the shifting mist, the crooked ferry sat waiting to carry its next burden, not of passengers, but of memory. The following day dawned without drama. No thunder, no rainfall, only a colorless sky and the low hush of the tide drawing back from the harbor wall. The world seemed subdued, as though it too felt the weariness of truth laid bare. But within the Royal Victoria Hotel, the air still pulsed with the remnants of judgment, as though the echo of the confession had embedded itself in the wallpaper and floorboards. The lounge, once filled with wary strangers and hidden motives, now stood nearly empty, save for Poirot, myself, and Inspector Bradley, who lingered by the mantel as if reluctant to write the final line in a book too heavy for its spine. Bradley closed his case folder with a sound more like surrender than closure. "It's strange," he murmured, "how the most thorough investigations sometimes leave you with the most unanswered questions." Poirot did not look up from his tea. "That is because some truths, mon cher Inspecteur, are too tangled to be unraveled by logic alone. They live in the heart, and the heart obeys no law." Bradley nodded, still staring into the empty fireplace. "I suppose I believed naively, perhaps, that a confession would bring clarity, but it feels more like fog. Not the kind outside, but the kind that settles inside a man after he's seen too much." Poirot smiled faintly. "You are wiser than most, then, for clarity is not the reward of justice, but its price." I stood by the window, watching a small group of seamen prepare the morning ferry for its routine voyage across the channel. They moved slowly, as if aware that this vessel had once carried not just passengers, but death itself. The ferry had returned to its ordinary rhythm, but something about it now felt different, as though the crooked path it had once taken still lingered in its hull. "Do you think he'll be convicted?" I asked, turning to Poirot. He stirred his tea gently. "Ah, Hastings, that is the work of judges and juries. My work is only to bring forth the truth, and the truth, you see, is already a kind of punishment." Lady Constance entered then, her steps slow but measured, her face pale yet composed. She had aged visibly in just 24 hours, not in the way that time ages a body, but in the way revelation strips a soul bare. "I came to say thank you," she said softly, addressing Poirot. He inclined his head politely. "There is no need, madam. You gave us the key the moment you opened your doors and allowed the ghosts inside to speak." Her lips trembled. "I loved my son, but I see now that love can sometimes become a kind of blindness. I let him build a life on the backs of the forgotten, and I did nothing when those foundations began to crack. Geoffrey, he's not evil, but he is broken, and I fear I helped shape the hand that struck." Poirot rose, stepping gently toward her. "You gave him loyalty, but you also gave him silence. And now, you give him something far more valuable, truth. Let that be his inheritance." She nodded, and for the first time, tears glistened in her eyes, not from guilt, but from the fragile hope of redemption. That afternoon, as we stood at the edge of the dock, watching the waves gather themselves into slow folds, Poirot turned to me. "You know, Hastings, in all my years of unraveling murders, I have come to believe something rather unfashionable, that the dead are not always the ones most in need of peace." I frowned. "You mean the survivors?" "Yes," he said quietly. "The survivors, the ones left to live with the weight of what they could not prevent." The wind picked up then, carrying with it the scent of the sea and the faint memory of salt-stung confessions. Somewhere in the distance, the ferry gave a low groan as its engines prepared to turn once again. It was no longer the crooked ferry, no longer cursed by secrets or cloaked in fog. And yet, As we boarded the train back to London, I knew that its decks would always remember. Not the murder, but the silence before it. The seconds where justice waited in a corridor. The 15 minutes between death and discovery. And above all, the heartbeat of a man who had once believed the law could not reach him. It had, just not in the way he expected. And as the train pulled away, the sea swallowed the last of the harbor shadow, leaving only the rhythm of rails and the quiet whisper of truths that had, at last, been heard. The days that followed unfolded with a gentleness that belied the storm that had passed. Fernwood-on-Sea, ever resilient in its quiet way, returned to its rhythm. Shopkeepers raised their shutters, church bells resumed their familiar cadence, and the sea breathed its salt-laden breath upon the village stones. But in the hearts of those who had touched the truth, the aftershocks continued, less violent, more reflective. At Windermere House, curtains were drawn open each morning, though fewer rooms remained occupied. Lady Constance stayed on, a quiet sentinel amid the ruins of legacy. She no longer held court in the parlor, nor did she write letters in her perfumed stationery. Instead, she walked the gravel paths of the garden, each footstep a prayer, each breath an apology she would never voice aloud. Her once impenetrable dignity had softened into something far rarer, humility. Colonel Whitmore's trial, as predicted, stirred national interest. The newspapers devoured the moral ambiguities of his case, with a hunger that had little to do with justice and everything to do with spectacle. They spoke of betrayal, of colonial cruelties buried beneath medals and rank, of a system that created monsters in fine uniforms and left their victims to rot in anonymous graves. But Poirot, who had returned to London long before the verdict was read, refused to engage in such headlines. "The world," he told me as we sat in the corner of a quiet Bloomsbury cafe, "will always hunger for the simple version. But real justice, mon ami, is not a clean cut. It is a wound that must be kept open long enough to be properly understood." I sipped my tea, watching a young couple pass by the window, their hands brushing awkwardly, tenderly. "Do you think he regrets it?" I asked. Poirot was silent for a long moment. Then, "I believe he regrets many things, but not the murder." There was no condemnation in his voice, only weariness, only truth. "Was he wrong, Poirot?" I asked quietly. "To take justice into his own hands?" Poirot sighed, his fingers steepled as he gazed into his reflection in the cafe glass. "Ah, Hastings, you asked the question every man must answer for himself. He was not wrong to feel what he felt, but to act upon it. That is where morality parts ways with justice." Outside, London moved on. Policemen guided traffic. Newsboys cried headlines. Somewhere a whistle blew. Somewhere a child laughed. Life had no time for moral debates. Yet I could not shake the image of the ferry, adrift in fog, carrying with it not just passengers, but centuries of unspoken wrongs, and one man's desperate act to atone for them. Before we parted ways that evening, Poirot handed me a small package. "Open it later," he said, "when the city is quiet and your thoughts have room." That night, I unwrapped it by lamplight in my flat. Inside was a compass, an old brass naval piece. On the back, engraved words, "To find justice, one must first lose direction." I smiled. Of course, it was from Colonel Whitmore. And of course, Poirot had ensured it reached me. Because though the law had taken its due, and though the murder had been solved, this mystery, like all the ones that mattered, was never truly about a weapon or a locked room. It was about conscience. And conscience, once awakened, is a sound that never fades. Just like the quiet toll of a bell in fog. Just like truth, forever ringing.